Welcome to the Cloud of Witnesses, a series on the history of Christianity. This is part one of a 10-part series from the origins of the Christian faith until the Middle Ages around the year 600. I trust you'll find the information both informative and helpful. If you find it's a lot to take in at once, remember, you can always pause at any time and return to it later. In part one, we're going to look at a variety of subjects, and these include why study the history of Christianity, and hopefully I'll provide you with some reasons to persevere in watching the series. Evaluating ancient texts in terms of their historical reliability, including the New Testament documents. Discussing then how do we evaluate historical evidence. We'll then look at some backgrounds of the Roman Empire, and we'll include focusing on Roman religion and philosophy as well as many other topics. And then we'll focus on the New Testament. We'll evaluate the polity or leadership structure of the early church as recorded in the New Testament, and also discuss New Testament evidence in light of the issues of controversy over infant or believer's baptism and Sabbath or Sunday observance. Webster's Dictionary of 1828 has an interesting comment in describing what history is. It says, "What is the history of nations but a narrative of the follies, crimes, and miseries of man?" What do you think of this statement? Does this mean we should just give up now? One wit said, "The only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn anything from history." When we look back 1300 years ago, there was an English church historian called Bede, sometimes called the Venerable Bede, and this is what he had to say about history. If history records good things of good men, the thoughtful hearer is encouraged to imitate what is good. Or if it records evil of wicked men, the good religious listener or reader is encouraged to avoid all that is sinful and perverse, and to follow what he knows to be good and pleasing to God. Here, Bede outlines reasons why we should study history in general, and perhaps why we should study church history in particular. So how would you answer this question? What reasons would you give to studying church history? Well, here's just a few things for you to think about. First of all, in history we can often see God at work. We see his providence. At times, God's work in human history is subtle. For example, the incarnation is just one of those subtle events. In terms of historical impact, the incarnation was at the time insignificant. Today, however, with 33% of the world's population claiming to be Christian, the birth of Jesus of Nazareth is arguably one of the most influential events in human history. We might look at examples of God's providence in such things as the miracle of Dunkirk or the defeat of the Nazi armies in Russia as the winter closed in. Perhaps the defeat of the Spanish Armada, also due to the weather. Maybe the fall of Russian communism or the collapse of apartheid, or the civil rights changes in the 1960s in the US. Secondly, we can be inspired and motivated by others. Hebrews 12:1, which started with this video, there are many examples of faithful men, that cloud of witnesses, and I should add faithful women, who encourage us to work for God's kingdom and to give our lives in total obedience to Christ. Perhaps it's also important to note when we look at other people and we are inspired by them, we've got to be careful of making idols of them. History shows us a collection of sinners that are forgiven by God's grace. It's a comfort to know that they are just as we are. They're people with feet of clay and have imperfections. This also should encourage us not to be too judgmental. Bede pointed out that we can learn from and avoid making similar mistakes that others have made in the past. We can better understand the nature of God and Jesus. In understanding theologically complex issues, such as the divinity and the humanity of Jesus, the Trinity, etc., many church fathers have wrestled with these important issues, and we can learn a lot from their understanding. We see evidence of biblical truth in history. For example, history reveals to us the sinfulness of human beings. We know that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and we can see the reality and the impact of original sin and human depravity in so many events throughout human history. And this is the point being made in the Webster's Dictionary quote. We can see many examples of evil within our world even today. And I guess we can become a bit discouraged too. When we're reminded, Romans 12:21 says, "Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." We need to remember that God's in control and that others have had to face challenges and threats in their day, just as we do today. And despite the evils of the past and the despair of the present, we need to remember that whether we are pre or post or amillennialists, the future is one of hope, as seen in Revelation 21:3 and 4. As some wit had said regarding Revelation, take a look in the back of the book. Jesus wins. Another thing we see evidence of biblical truth in history is the reality of God's grace and forgiveness, because God uses frail, fragile, and sinful human beings to work his purposes. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7 says, "We have this treasure in earthen vessels." Thirdly, we also see examples of people reaping what they sow, as Galatians 6:7 warns. I guess this relates to the idea of cause and effect. We can perhaps better understand the present by understanding events of the past, and we can also appreciate the present. Despite the problems in our world, there's still a lot to be thankful for. When we compare life in the past with all its dangers and difficulties, we're actually very blessed in so many ways. History also gives us the knowledge or the reality that life is temporary and short. It reminds us too that it's important to live it well for God and for others. Psalm 90 verse 12 says, "Teach us to number our days so that we may get a heart of wisdom." And to conclude with, if I could just be a little bit facetious for a moment, we could win important competitions. It was interesting on the million-dollar question on who wants to be a millionaire was based on the question, who founded the Monte Cassino Monastery? And I wonder, would you know that answer at the moment? Well, the answer is Benedict of Nursia, and we'll come across him a little bit later in the course. Before we begin looking at the history of the church or the history of Christianity, just a couple of observations regarding historical evidence. First of all, it's important to note that there's a lack of original documents. For example, regarding Plato or Aristotle, while there are often some or many ancient copies of their work, there are no originals. And often in the case of ancient documents, there's a large time difference between the author and the earliest copies we have. This doesn't necessarily diminish the historical reliability of those documents, but it's something to be aware of. What's perhaps interesting when we're discussing this issue is comparing the time difference between various historical figures and Christian documents. So a couple of examples. Thucydides, he wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. This were the wars between Athens and Sparta. He was a Greek writer who wrote about 450 to 400 BC. Now, the earliest copy we have of Thucydides' work is 900 AD approximately. So there's a time difference of 1500 years between the time he wrote his histories and the earliest copies we have. Tacitus is regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians. In fact, his Annals is one of the earliest secular historical records to mention Christ, which Tacitus does in connection with Nero's persecution of the Christians, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But Tacitus wrote about 110 AD. The earliest copies of his work are dated to about 850 AD, so the time difference again is quite large, 750 years. But yet, from a historical point, there's no question that people like Tacitus and Thucydides lived, and what they've said is historically accurate. What is interesting is to compare the textual evidence supporting the reliability of the New Testament with these ancient historians. We have, for example, about 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that date to around 350 AD. We have a complete codex or book called the Codex Alexandrinus around 400 AD, and another, the Codex Sinaiticus of 350 AD, and the Codex Vaticanus a little earlier, 325 to 350 AD. Then we have a number of significant individual manuscripts that are dated even earlier than the codexes. And this group includes the Chester Beatty Papyrus, papyrus number 75, the Bodmer Papyrus, a fragment of the Diatessaron. Now, the Diatessaron was the first attempt to harmonise the four Gospels, and it was dated to 160. But the oldest known fragment of the New Testament is possibly the John Ryland Papyrus, dated to somewhere between 130 to 150 AD. As we're looking at this example of the Chester Beatty Papyrus, it is possibly interesting to note that it was written in what's called uncial script, and that is, it was written in capitals without any spacing or punctuation. And this sort of writing helps the dating of early papyrus. Note too that it doesn't have any verse or chapter divisions, and these came much later, possibly around the early 1200s for the modern chapters, and the verses came around the mid-1500s. In fact, the earliest Bible to have both chapters and verses was the Genevan Bible, which was printed around the year 1560. The important point here is the short gap between the writing of the New Testament documents and the earliest copies we have. The New Testament was written from about the mid-1st century, and John possibly from the late 1st century. So the earliest copy is potentially less than 100 years after the time it was originally written. Now, while this alone does not prove the historical accuracy of the New Testament documents, it is a very significant fact in the discussion. Before we go further in evaluating Christianity in history, I want to make a couple of observations for you to think about. Firstly, history is not so much about absolute facts, but conclusions based on evidence. Now, why have I said this? Let's look at a couple of modern examples of historical facts in inverted commas. The pictures I'm showing to you, you will be aware that there are certain people who will debate the facts around them. So some of these facts are disputed. So how do we know what really happened? Well, to make historical claims, we look at the evidence. We're like detectives. It might be helpful to compare mathematics to this example from history. Maths is, at its basic level, about facts. For example, what does 2 plus 2 equal? It equals 4. But history is a little bit more like this. We have at our disposal certain evidence or facts. So we have, say, the number 4. But then we ask, how did we get this number? Was the number derived from the sum 1 plus 3 or 2 plus 2 or 2 times 2? So we've got to look at the evidence and weigh it all up to find how we came to the answer 4. In addition, we must also evaluate the evidence we do have. As mentioned, we have the role of a detective. We gather the facts, we present the evidence, and we become the jury, evaluating the evidence. Now, to do all this, these are some questions we need to ask. How long after the events are the facts being presented? For example, if someone is writing about events that took place 200 years earlier, we might have more questions regarding their accuracy when compared with someone who is writing events and lived at that time. So the longer the time difference, the greater caution we need, generally speaking. So we should be asking, is the writer an eyewitness? And this helps support their evidence. We also must ask, what biases might they have? For example, are they supporting or condemning what they're writing about? If we can get two sides of the story from two different sources, then all the better. We should also add that we don't reject things simply because they're written from a biased point of view. We just need to allow that in our evaluation of the historical evidence. This discussion over historical evidence will be important when we look at later documents. In the meantime, let's have a look at the setting into which the church was born, the backgrounds to the Roman Empire. We'll begin with the political situation. From the years 509 to 27 BC, there was what is called the Roman Republic. This was where Rome was ruled by elected senators, which were made up of leading patrician families. However, things changed from 27 BC on with the rule of Augustus. This is Caesar Augustus, who's mentioned in the New Testament in the context of Jesus' birth. Things had changed. Rome was, from that point on, an autocratic state, led by the emperor who controlled the army and all finances. And the Senate became a rubber stamp and merely advised the emperor. Here is where the Roman Senate met. It's still one of the best preserved buildings in the Forum area of Rome today. This is an interior view of the Senate called the Curia. Geographically, the Roman Empire at its greatest physical extent had 28 provinces. It stretched from the Euphrates in the east to the Scottish-English border in the west. It had approximately 80 to 90 million subjects at its height. It is important for us to note that Israel had been conquered by the Romans under General Pompey in 63 BC. Ancient Rome was known for being located on 7 hills, and these can be seen on this map. These 7 hills are probably being referenced by John in Revelation 17:9 when he says, "This calls for a mind of wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits." And the woman John refers to is otherwise called the Great Harlot and has the words Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth, written on her forehead. The city of Rome, of course, was the capital of the empire. According to estimates, the population of the city was 1 million people at its maximum extent. The Palatine Hill was the original site on which Rome was founded. It later became the location for the palaces of the various emperors. Augustus, for example, had built his palace on this site. In front stood the Circus Maximus, which was a large hippodrome. Today, all that remains of these palaces are ruins. But even so, their size gives us an idea of how incredible these buildings must have been at one point. At the heart of ancient Rome was the Forum. Initially there was only one, called the Roman Forum. Later came the Forum of Augustus, which wasn't as large, and then Trajan's Forum. The Forum was a place for meeting, and many of the shops were located there. We'll now have a brief virtual tour of the forums of Rome, and we'll begin with the Roman Forum. Within the confines of the Roman Forum could be found many temples.
The perimeter, the rectangular perimeter was indoor, was a beautiful portico, and all around.
The Roman Forum was also the central location for government activities, such as the Tabularium, which contained government documents, the Senate, the law courts, and a small prison for those awaiting execution. It was also the hub for business and the location of many shops. Socially, there was a single language throughout the empire. It was actually Greek. This was the language of trade, perhaps similar to how English is used today. The Italian language, or Latin, would eventually predominate in the western part of the empire, but this was still a few hundred years in the future. While there was great wealth, we can see examples of this in the buildings, yet there was also a great disparity between the rich and the poor. It was very much a society based on class. Roman citizenship was highly sought after as it brought many privileges. A person could become a Roman citizen through birth or by purchasing the privilege. And we see an example of this in Paul's comment when he's asked about his citizenship and the special privileges it entitled him to in Acts 22:25 and also in Acts 16:38. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes," he answered. "I paid a high price for my citizenship," said the commander. "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Broadly speaking, society was broken up into a number of groups or classes. There was the wealthy aristocracy, they were the landowners, the government contractors, the speculators. Then there was the middle class. Although slave labour was detrimental to the wealth of this group, and so many starved out of their small farms and so had to join the homeless and the hungry mobs. There were the plebeians, the poor. They lived in pitiful conditions and sometimes worse off than slaves themselves. They were mostly unemployed. And then, of course, you had the slave class. It was thought that about 1/3 of the empire, that means about 60 million people, were slaves. Now, some of these slaves were actually educated professionals. Some were treated kindly and regarded as being family members, and this meant that they had regular food. But generally speaking, life for slaves was hard. They were completely at their master's mercy. Some gained enough money to earn their freedom, and some were granted their freedom. Now, regarding these different classes in Roman society, there was some movement between these levels, and some slaves rose to important positions. With regard to the role of women, some women had great wealth and had political power, but not political office. But they ruled in the name of their husband, and so they influenced those in power through their own economic power. As mentioned, there was great financial inequality in the Roman Empire. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it destroyed the city of Pompeii, but it preserved for us, captured by the volcanic ash, a city from the Roman period, and we can learn so much about life in the Roman Empire from the discoveries at Pompeii. In particular, we see the great disparity between the rich and the poor. Here's an example of the home of a wealthy family in Pompeii.
We will now enter one of the houses in Pompeii, before the volcanic outbreak 2,000 years ago. It is the house of Caecilius Jucundus, one of the rich men of Pompeii. In the morning, the big entrance room must have contained many dependent people coming around to salute the owner, and probably also Jucundus' business companions from Rome and Pompeii. In the afternoon, the room must have changed character, with weaving women and a lot of household work going on. The light conditions changed throughout the day, the daylight flowing in from the upper part of the room together with rainwater that was collected here, and in the night only oil lamps. This is Jucundus himself, and this is his money chest. He was certainly a rich man, although he didn't belong to the uppermost elite of the town. We know from his business correspondence that he belonged to the level just below the richest and the political elite in Pompeii. This is the house altar, very lavishly decorated and reminiscent of an earthquake 17 years before the big volcanic eruption, year 79 AD. Look at the cleverly built light intake here. This is what allowed people to work here during daytime. This is the working room of the family father. It is called the tabularium, and this is why we placed a table here to mark the case. It is the most beautifully decorated room in the house to mark the status of the owner. When we return to the paintings as they are today, you can see that the big mythological paintings have been removed to museums. And this is also true in the banquet hall, somewhat further inside the house. This is where Jucundus received his guests in the evenings. There were a restricted number of guests in this room and in Roman banquets in general, less than 10 persons. In the garden rooms, Jucundus could relax in the afternoon in nice conditions with a view of the play fountain in the garden. We must believe that there were slaves everywhere and lots of house people, for this was not a house for one family, but a house for a big extended one.
In contrast to the wealthy homes such as we've seen at Pompeii, we notice the homes of the poor in Rome. The poor were crowded into large apartment blocks called insulae, and it's estimated that there were as many as 46,600 throughout the city of Rome. In contrast, there were only about 1,800 private homes.
This humble brick building doesn't look like much from the outside. Most visitors walk past it without even giving it a glance. But once you know what it is, a very different Rome opens up before your eyes.
This building was converted into a Christian church, but originally it was an ancient Roman high-rise apartment block. The city was full of them. They were called, in Latin, insulae. That means islands. So think away the churchy bits, and ancient Rome lies underneath. Right down there, you can still see the ancient street level, and facing onto the street, there are a series of shops with wide entrances, and above them, little mezzanine flats. So these guys were literally living above the shop. But up here, there were 6, perhaps 7 more floors, more than survive today. But to get the real, authentic Roman impression, you have to remember that just a few feet that way, there was another block like this. So this wasn't so much a nice open road down there, it was a narrow alley. It must have felt like a canyon between 2 vast buildings.
The flats are usually locked up, but I've got permission to have a look around with my colleague Ed Bispham, who's been here many times before.
So we are at, what's the first floor?
This is the first floor proper,
level.
yeah.
And this then is the window?
This is the window, so we're really burgling. We're breaking and entering here.
Right, okay. Gosh.
The windows have since been blocked up, but on the first floor there was once a spacious apartment where a reasonably well-off family might have lived, with their children and slaves.
You wouldn't be pushed for space in here as a single family. I mean, you've got probably 4 nicely barrel-vaulted rooms here.
But further up the building, light, space and fresh air was in much shorter supply. Up here, off each dark corridor, are 4 or 5 rooms just a few metres square. We don't know for sure how many people lived here, but to get 1 million people into a city the size of Rome, you had to pile them high and squash them in. My guess is that these weren't single occupancy.
This looks a bit spacious, but that's because the dividing walls have gone. So you've got to imagine a wall here going
right the way up to the vault with maybe a little light window in it.
The thing that always kind of shocks me is the sense that we might have had 6 people living, in inverted commas, in here. This is 1 step up, 1 or 2 steps up, actually, from the real bottom of Roman society, isn't it?
Compared to sleeping in a tomb or under an aqueduct arch. This is quite bijou.
Here's another bijou apartment. This is really small. We've got to get, well, let's say we might have 4 or 6 people in here. You know, one question is, how do they fit? And I'm now going to see what it would be like. You know, how much space does one person take up trying to get to sleep on the floor? Oh, not much space left.
No.
And who are the guys and the women who are living in these? What are they doing?
The guys are probably working on construction projects. You need to think of a big thing like the bars of Caracalla, bars of Diocletian. We're talking 6,000 to 10,000 people on a 4-year building job. And then there's porterage.
Pumping the amphorae from the barges to the warehouse.
Sacks of grain,
Day labour, you get it when you can.
You think about it, I mean, you've been working all day, you've been humping stuff about. You get back here, you're soaked in sweat, you stink, you don't have any spare clothes, there's no running water, you can't have a bath, and there's 3 other smelly guys sleeping on the floor too.
Or there's your partner, your female partner, and 2 kids.
Yes.
I mean, one thing is to think about these as sort of male dorm accommodation, which I think a lot of them must be, but for some of them, you know, there are women having babies here.
Yes.
You know, and actually, where I'm sitting, some woman probably gave birth. That's what's scary.
Yeah.
And that wasn't even the top of the block. There were even more stories above this one. The basic rule was, the further you went up, the worse it got. There were no luxury penthouses here. This was social climbing backwards. In their time, these tenements must have been the tallest residential buildings on the planet. But they were built poorly, cheaply and fast, and only a handful have survived to any height. So the fact is, we no longer think of ancient Rome like this.
But that is how we should see it. Not just a city of marble, but a city of tower blocks, and the ordinary people who lived in them.
Economically, there was a single monetary system, which of course made trade relatively easy. The coins were made up of a pound, which was called an aureus, which equaled 24 denarii. The silver denarius was a day's wage, and this is mentioned in the New Testament. Many cities had the privilege of minting their own coins. As we've said, there was great wealth in the form of buildings with many engineering marvels, aqueducts, sewers, the use of the dome, underwater concrete throughout the empire. Industry and trade, well, transport by today's standard was slow and therefore trade was expensive. Although Rome did have excellent roads and there were inns located at convenient intervals, and so it made travel at this time relatively easier. And we see again in the book of Acts, Paul often used these Roman roads in travelling the empire. Water was also a primary means of trade, both the use of rivers and of course the Mediterranean Sea. The so-called Pax Romana, or Roman peace, meant that sea trade flourished. Pirates had been got rid of by General Pompey. And we see this in examples of Paul and Luke as they travel the Mediterranean Sea. Their concern was not pirates, but it was regarding the weather. Evidence of trade can be seen in the examples of copper, linen and paper, which came from Egypt, earthenware, which came from northern Italy. In addition, there was gold, ivory, pearls and jewels, and rare woods. Agriculturally, in the Roman Empire, the coastal territories were more fertile than today. North Africa, for example, which is largely desert, had large farms with cattle, fruit and vegetables. Irrigation was practiced. Fertilisers were used, as well as crop rotation. Roman culture was strongly influenced by the Greeks, and this cultural influence was known as Hellenism. Greek philosophers such as Heraclitus, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle also influenced Roman thinking. Plato and Aristotle also had an influence on Christian ideas and theology, and we'll look at them in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, Let's focus on Heraclitus, who lived around about 500 BC. Now, the idea that there was a rational mind behind the universe was not new, but Heraclitus identified this rational force as the Logos, and this is from the Greek meaning word. Now, for the Greeks, Logos was not a belief in a personal God, so perhaps we're best to understand this like the Force in the Star Wars films. And of course, the idea of Logos would be taken up by John. In John 1:1, he begins his gospel by saying, "In the beginning was the Logos." In the beginning was the Word. And he goes on, "And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God." And then in verse 14, "And the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us." So John was perhaps taking ideas from Heraclitus, but also from others like Philo, which we will be mentioning a little later. Socrates, who lived in the 5th century BC, emphasised rational argument, a concern with a person's or one's soul, and also emphasised ethics. He said that virtue was knowledge. He argued that no one does wrong willingly, only out of ignorance. So his ideas denied the concepts of total depravity and the willfulness of sin. Today we might see this attitude being expressed with the ideas of education is the solution to society's ills. Socrates said it's better to be wronged than to wrong someone else. In other words, don't retaliate. And these ideas particularly were quite foreign to the conventional beliefs of Athens of the time. Incidentally, Socrates is regarded as having introduced the Socratic method, and this is where questions were used as a form of inquiry, and so writings are a dialogue between a questioner and the answerer. Socrates was charged in 399 BC with neglecting the established gods and introducing new ideas and divinities. He was sentenced to death, and he didn't flee, and he took his own life drinking poison. The Greek philosopher Plato, who lived between 427 and 347 BC, believed in the immortality of the soul and the existence of a more perfect world beyond our own. He argued that the world in which we live is only an experience of the shadows of what's real, and his views are known as the theory of forms. To help understand Plato's theory of forms, here's a quote from Plato's work, The Republic. "Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open toward the light and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, and you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets." "I see." "And do you see," I said, "men passing along the wall carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figurines of animals made of wood and stone and various materials, which appear over the wall? Some of them are talking, others silent." "You've shown me a strange image, and they are strange prisoners." "Like ourselves," I replied, "and they see only their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, for which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave." So what did Plato mean by this illustration? Essentially, he was arguing that the sensory world was a poor copy of an eternal world, of real form. All we see are the shadows of what is a greater reality. In this higher realm, there exist the forms that embody the true nature of these shadows. So, for example, what we know as sweet is only an image of the form of sweetness. The brightness of the sun is only a display of the form of brightness. Perhaps if we think of the example of a triangle, this might help understand what Plato was getting at. If we're asked to draw a triangle, we have in our mind what a triangle is. However, when we actually draw that triangle, the reality is different to what we have in our mind. What we draw is imperfect. There exists, in a sense, in another world, in a perfect world, a true triangle. So what we're seeing in the world, according to Plato, is not true reality. Only a pure soul could attain or understand the real world through philosophical contemplation. At the head of this reality stood what he called the good, and later Christian thinkers, influenced by Neoplatonists, would identify the ultimate form with God. Later, other Christian writers would also work from the world of ideas in order to prove God's existence. One example of this was Anselm, who said that God is that which no greater can be conceived, because if we can conceive of a God, he must exist in reality, Anselm argued. And we'll come back to this argument a little bit later. While Plato was concerned more with ideas and concepts, Aristotle looked at the world as it is. He was interested in causes and argued that the universe is directed by rational laws. Therefore, we can learn truth by observation. Other Christian apologists, for example Thomas Aquinas, would use Aristotelian methods and logic to prove God's existence. He argued that there are causes for everything, and so therefore there must have been a first cause, and this was God, according to Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle said, "It is evident that the polis, or the state, belongs to the class of things that exist by nature, and that man is by nature an animal intended to live in a polis. The reason why man is being meant for political association in a higher degree than bees or other gregarious animals is evident. Nature makes nothing in vain, and man alone of the animals is furnished with the faculty of language." So we can see here Aristotle is looking at the natural order, animals congregating in communities. He therefore argues that man, being in a higher state than animals, is also naturally made for living in community. Raphael, in his Renaissance painting, The School of Athens, illustrates the difference between Plato and Aristotle's philosophical views as to where truth could be found. Raphael painted Plato with his finger pointing upward, pointing towards absolutes or ideals, which exist only on earth as shadows. In contrast, Aristotle is pictured with his fingers spread wide, facing the earth, emphasizing the particulars or the individual things which are around us. And it's here, he argued, we can find truth. Later, Plato's concepts would be modified and popularized by Plotinus, and this was called Neoplatonism. In addition, there were other philosophical ideas and movements. These had their origins in ancient Greece and included Stoicism, which was founded by Zeno of Citium around the year 300 BC. Theirs was an emphasis on virtues and the improving of a person's spiritual well-being. There was a focus on searching for truth and attaining wisdom. But later Stoicism focused on apatheia, meaning without passion. Emotion, it was thought, was a distraction. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus around the year 307 BC, essentially believed that pain was bad and that pleasure was good. Today, we might say that they had a philosophy of eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. However, this would not be entirely accurate, as Epicurus didn't advocate overindulgence. Other groups included the Pythagoreans, founded by the mathematician Pythagoras around 500 BC. And apart from other things, they observed a rule of silence. And there were the Cynics, founded by a friend of Socrates, Antisthenes, in the late 5th century BC. They were encouraged to live a simple life, free from all possessions. However, it must be remembered that the majority of ordinary Romans weren't interested in philosophy. It was only the well-educated who were. Two of these philosophical movements are mentioned in the book of Acts. It's recorded that while Paul was in Athens, some of these philosophers were wanting to know what he was teaching. Acts 17:18 says, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Roman religion began with animism, which was the belief that spirits inhabited objects. Over time, the worship of traditional Greek and Roman deities occurred. Roman religion was polytheistic, meaning they worshipped many gods and goddesses. There were in fact so many that in Acts 17:23, Paul, while in Athens, mentions having seen an altar dedicated to an unknown god, he says. The Romans adopted many of the Greek gods and gave them Roman names. For example, the Greek Zeus, the head of the pantheon of gods, became the Roman Jupiter. Each god had an important role or function. For example, Juno, who was Jupiter's wife, was the goddess of fertility and childbirth. In addition, there were gods for agriculture, music, love, just to name a few. Various legends and stories grew up around these gods. The stories showed that the gods were in reality magnified men and women. They were even sometimes criticised by the philosophers who pointed to the immorality of the gods and their bad example. These gods were represented as idols in the form of statues. Worship took place at temples, but there were also shrines which could be found along the roads or even in homes. At these shrines, prayers, offerings, for example fruit, were given and vows would be made. In addition, there was also emperor worship. This was the deification of the Roman emperor himself. It was called the imperial cult. This held that the emperor was one of the gods who should be worshipped, and this cult developed over time. The first Caesar to be deified after his death was Julius Caesar in the year 42 BC. And later a temple was erected on the site where he was cremated. However, often temples were erected and incense offered before statues of the living emperor. Here are, for example, some steps to a ruined temple that had been built by Herod the Great in Samaria, and it was dedicated to Caesar Augustus. But living emperors also began to claim this title of deity, and that, of course, would cause problems with the Christians. Emperor worship was seen as a symbol of unity for the empire, and therefore refusal to do so was regarded as an act of treason. This, of course, would directly challenge the early Christians who refused to acknowledge Caesar as Lord or God. This aspect of Roman religion was formal and cold, and there was no personal identification with the deity. There were also many so-called mystery religions. Some of these rites associated with these religions had parallels with Christian beliefs. For example, these groups had initiation ceremonies, sacred meals, an emphasis on asceticism, a conception of redemption through union with the gods, and a concern for the immortality of the soul. Mystery religions had what is termed Gnostic elements, and this comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. This so-called knowledge was only imparted to those who had been initiated into the particular Gnostic group, so it was regarded as secret knowledge. This so-called secret knowledge gave rise to their broad identification as mystery religions. There were expensive fees for the impartation of this secret knowledge. Therefore, these mystery religions were usually only accessible to the wealthy. The attractiveness of these religions was that it promised an eternal existence for the soul and a union with the divine. When we use the word Gnosticism, it's often referencing Christian sects which adopted many of the ideas of these mystery religions. And Gnostic syncretism was to be a challenge to early Christianity. It is important to note that different local religions were accepted, as long as they did not threaten the state. An example of this was Judaism. Judaism was permitted, and many synagogues were scattered across the empire. This was due to the Jewish diaspora. These were Jewish communities outside of Israel. Many Gentiles were attracted to Judaism, and they became known as God-fearers. The Septuagint was an Old Testament translation into Greek. It was translated around 250 BC. The Septuagint made Jewish ideas more accessible to the Greek-speaking world. The Jewish writer Philo, who lived between the years 20 BC and 40 AD, who was from Alexandria in Egypt, emphasised the link between Greek philosophy and the Old Testament. When we look at Rome morally, we'll notice that things like prostitution were generally pervasive, and this included temple prostitution. Homosexuality was also accepted. In terms of marriage, divorce was easy, and often the woman had very little rights. Human life was cheap. Infanticide and abortion was also practiced. The Colosseum stands today as a reminder of how cheaply life was viewed during the Roman Empire. Over its 350 to 400 year history, the Colosseum saw perhaps as many as 400,000 or even more people being killed. In addition, approximately 1 million animals, it's estimated, were killed in the Colosseum. The spectacles that the people came to witness included the killing of captured slaves, the execution of criminals, and gladiatorial fights, sometimes with animals and sometimes gladiators fighting each other. We're now going to spend some time looking at the church of the first century, and we're going to focus on a couple of key issues of debate: that of church governance, whether it was elders and or bishops who were to be ruling over the church; baptism, whether it was infants or believers; and the day of worship, whether it was the Sabbath or the Sunday. And we'll start by examining the New Testament evidence, and then later look at some early documents of the church. The English words of elder and bishop come from two Greek words, presbyteros, which means elder, and episkopos, which means bishop. And you might recognise these words. Presbyteros links to the Presbyterian church, where elders are regarded as being in charge. And episkopos refers to Episcopalian churches, where a bishop is in charge. Generally speaking, the word presbyteros in the New Testament is used simply as a term for age, or as the elders, John 8:9, for example. The elders of the church are first mentioned in Acts 11:30, where it talks about them being in Jerusalem. We also have Paul and Barnabas appointing elders in every church in Acts 14:23 during their missionary journey. Note, there's no mention of the office of bishop in the examples in Acts. There's evidence in other parts of the New Testament that episkopos and presbyteros are referring to the one and same position. For example, Paul writes to Titus and says, "The reason I left you in Crete was that you might straighten out what was left unfinished and appoint presbyteros, or elders, in every town as I directed you. A presbyteros must be blameless, the husband of but one wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an episkopos, or bishop, or overseer, is entrusted with God's work, he must be blameless." Paul, in speaking to the Ephesian elders or presbyters, says, "Keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you episkopos, or bishops." He also adds, "Be shepherds," which we get the word pastor from. "Be shepherds of the church of God, which he bought with his own blood." There are other passages which support this view, such as 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 to 13, and 5:17, along with Philippians 1:1. Along with elders, there are a number of times when the role of deacon is mentioned. The word deacon comes from the Greek diakonos, which means servant. Deacons are mentioned in the church at Philippi. In Philippians 1:1, Paul writes, "Paul and Timothy are servants of Christ Jesus to all the saints in Christ Jesus at Philippi. together with the episkopos, or bishops, and diakonos, deacons. Just as a side point, here is another confirmation that the word episkopos is being used instead of the word presbyteros, or elder. It's thought that the passage of Acts chapter 6 refers to the appointment of deacons. This passage refers to a group appointed to look after the financial distribution of money to the widows. If Acts chapter 6 is not referring to the appointment of deacons, then from the New Testament it's not really clear what the role of the deacon would have been. There's also a discussion, could women be deacons? Now there is some evidence of this. Romans 16:1 says that Phoebe was a diakonos at Cenchrea, which is not far from Corinth. As we've pointed out, the Greek word diakonos can be understood as servant, and so some translations have the word servant instead of deacon here in Romans 16:1. 1 Timothy 3:11, which is in the context of deacons, is argued by some that, properly understood, it is referring to women deacons. And the passage says, "In the same way their wives are to be women worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything." Now the Greek says, women likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, clear-minded, etc. So there's no mention of the word wives in the original Greek. Along with elders and deacons, other roles or offices of the church were mentioned. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11 and 12 mentions 5 of them: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. It was he who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors. Poimen is the Greek here. And teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry. Now the word poimen, translated here as pastor, literally means shepherd. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 28, 9 roles are mentioned. But note here, in contrast to the list of 5 that are found in Ephesians 4, evangelists and pastors are missing. It says God has appointed in the church apostles, prophets, teachers, workers of miracles, healers, helpers, administrators, speakers of tongues, and interpreters of tongues. Let's have a brief examination of the 5 roles or offices that are mentioned in Ephesians chapter 4. Mention here of apostles. These were not the 12 apostles. These were others. Romans 16 verse 7 says, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow countrymen and fellow prisoners. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was." Now the word apostle comes from the Greek noun apostolos, which links to the Greek verb to send. So in a general sense, an apostle was someone who was sent out on a mission. They were a missionary or a delegate. Again, could women be apostles? Well, there is a debate over the name Junia or Junius that's mentioned here in Romans 16:7. Some commentators argue that it is a feminine name, arguing that there's no evidence to support the alternative position that it is a shortened form of the masculine Junius. The only reference to the office of pastor in the New Testament is found in this passage from Ephesians chapter 4. It should be noted that the reference there to pastors is in the plural. There's no mention in the New Testament of the role of a singular pastor, as exists in many churches today. There are, however, references to the verbal form of the Greek word poimen. Now, while it means to shepherd, it can also be understood as to pastor. Of two verbal forms of instruction to shepherd in the New Testament, both are in the context of the function of the elders. One example can be seen in the passage we looked at earlier. Paul, in speaking his farewell address to the Ephesian elders, encourages them, saying, "Be shepherds," or "be pastors of the church of God, which he bought with his own blood." The other is a passage from 1 Peter chapter 5, and it also identifies that elders had a shepherding or a pastoral role. "To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds," i.e. pastors, "of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be." There are a couple of locations where the role of prophet is mentioned. Acts 13:1 points out that in the church at Antioch there were prophets and teachers. And 1 Corinthians 14:29 gives some instructions as to the role of the prophets when they come together. 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. In learning to understand what the function of a New Testament prophet was, we could perhaps start by looking at Old Testament models. Old Testament scholars have identified 2 broad roles that the Old Testament prophets had. They included foretelling and forthtelling. And we can see situations of foretelling through some of the examples in the New Testament, for example, the prophet Agabus. But it could also perhaps be assumed that prophets of the New Testament had the role of forthtelling, in other words, giving God's counsel on a specific situation. And we can see examples of Paul doing this in his many letters. Could women be prophets? There are a couple of examples in the New Testament which indicate that they could. In Acts 21:9, we're told that Philip had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. And Paul, in 1 Corinthians 11:4 and 5, and then in verse 13, also makes mention of women praying and prophesying. And every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonours her head. It's important to note here that prophecy can only be understood in a corporate or a church context. So one did not prophesy to oneself. Teachers are mentioned in Ephesians 4 and in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And the specific role of prophet and teacher are mentioned as existing at the church at Antioch in Acts 13:1, which says, "In the church at Antioch there were prophets and teachers." And then 5 specific individuals are named, but we're not told if they were all prophets and teachers or whether some were prophets and others were teachers. In other words, the roles are not clearly set out. The role of teacher isn't clearly stated elsewhere in the New Testament. There were Jewish teachers of the law, which were mentioned numerous times. And there is a passage in 1 Timothy chapter 1 which gives a clue that the teachers mentioned in the New Testament had a similar function to the Old Testament teachers of the law. It says, "Some have wandered away from these and turned to meaningless talk. They wanted to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they are talking about or what they so confidently affirm." What does the New Testament teach us about church practices? For example, is there evidence of either liturgy or church service order? There are examples where singing is mentioned in both Ephesians and Colossians. Ephesians 5:19 urges those to address one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. James 5:16 talks about confessing your sins to each other. However, It's not clear whether this was to be in a formal public setting or whether this was to be more private and more personal. Regular giving, but not necessarily tithing, is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. On the first day of every week, each of you should set aside a portion of his income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will be needed. However, Paul doesn't specify that this collection was to be carried out like we might have today, a collection time. The clearest reference to liturgy comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where it says, "When you come together, everyone has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. All of these must be done for the strengthening of the church. 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop, for you can all prophesy in turn, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged." It's thought that some liturgical order is hinted in this passage, which is also from 1 Corinthians. Paul says, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" What about baptism in the New Testament? It is important to note that there are no specific examples of infant baptism being practiced in the New Testament. Those that argue that infant baptism took place base it on the assumption that infants were part of a household or family, as mentioned in these 3 examples. In Acts chapter 16, verses 14 and 15, Luke says that Lydia was baptised with her household. Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, said that he did baptise members of the household of Stephanus. Also at Philippi, Luke mentions that the jailer was baptised with his family. Now, those who oppose the assumption that infants were baptised as part of these groups argues that if the word household included unbelieving children, it would also be legitimate to conclude that unbelieving slaves were also baptised, as they too at that time were considered to be part of the household. Now, the first 2 examples do not give us any extra information that would help clarify this discussion either way. They're just brief statements with no extra detail. Does the context help in answering this question? Well, perhaps there is one example where context helps, and that's Acts 16, 31 to 33, which is the example of the Philippian jailer. Before being baptised, Paul had said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household." Now, this verse is hotly debated. Did it mean that if the Philippian jailer believed, he and his household would be saved? Or was it a statement meaning, if you and your household believe, then you will be saved? The verse which follows is helpful in this discussion, and it says, "Paul and Silas spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house." So this suggests that the household contained people of an age of understanding who needed to believe before being baptised. There's also been a discussion regarding the New Testament teaching in terms of the mode of baptism. Was it by immersion, pouring, or sprinkling? Well, the Greek word baptizo does literally mean dip or submerge. We also have the example of the baptism of John the Baptist, where it says, "Now John was also baptizing near Aenon, near Salem, because there was plenty of water, and people were coming and being baptized." Logically, this would not support the idea of sprinkling in this example. Others also point to the Jewish use of the mikveh, which was a ritual of total immersion. In addition, phrases such as went down into and came up out of the water, in the example of Philip baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, are all used to show that immersion, more than sprinkling or pouring, was used in the New Testament examples. Another area of discussion, or even dispute, is regarding the New Testament's teaching on the Sabbath and Sunday observance, or as it's called in the New Testament, the first day of the week. The New Testament evidence that the first day of the week was being used for meeting together is seen in the passage of Paul in 1 Corinthians 16, which we've looked at just before, which talks about the collection for the saints. And Paul says, "On the first day of every week, let each one of you put aside and save, as he may prosper, that there are no collections be made when I come." However, this passage is not explicit and really only refers to the setting aside of money each week on the first day of that week. Acts chapter 20 verse 7 is also referred to in this discussion. It says, "And on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread." The context, however, of this passage is not clear. We don't know whether this gathering on the first day of the week was a normal occurrence, or was it simply because Paul was visiting them at the time, and we know from the context of Acts he was departing the next day. Perhaps the most significant verse for this discussion is found in Revelation chapter 1, where John says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day." So this indicates that by the time of the writing of the book of Revelation, thought to be towards the end of the first century, that Sunday, which was the day of Christ's resurrection, of course, was being viewed as a special day, the Lord's Day. The phrase, the Lord's Day, also appears in a number of early church documents, and we'll look at this a little later. There are two other passages which perhaps hint that there may have been some fluidity regarding the day of worship. Romans 14 verses 5 and 6 says, "One man regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Let each man be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord." And Colossians chapter 2 says, "Therefore let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." So these passages show that it's not totally clear from the New Testament that Christians gathered and worshipped on the first day of the week. And we'll need to, as I mentioned, look at early documents and see what they have to say about this issue. Where did Christians meet for worship? Well, it's fairly obvious that homes were used. They're referred to in a number of places, such as Philemon 2, the church in your house, it says. Romans 16:5, 1 Corinthians 16:19, and Colossians 4 verse 15 all talk about Christians meeting in homes. But there were other possible worship locations. For example, Paul met in the hall of Tyrannus in Ephesus. It's mentioned in Acts 19:9. And another occasion, Paul hints that perhaps another location other than homes is being spoken of. He said, "When you meet together, is it not the Lord's Supper that you eat? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in?" We've now come to the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll be looking at Christian documents of the first 2 centuries, and these include, among others, a letter from the church at Rome to the church at Corinth, the Didache or teaching, the 7 letters of Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch, the letter and the martyrdom of Polycarp, the Bishop of Smyrna, and a document called the Shepherd of Hermas. And we'll be focusing on what we can learn from these early documents regarding theology and church practices.